Hello everyone. I think we're working to a tight schedule today, so I'm going to start. So to give a few more people, excuse me, a couple of minutes to join us, I have a little short video that I will play just to let you settle yourselves and maybe grab a coffee. Hello and welcome to today's lunchtime seminar. Just before we start, I have a little bit of housekeeping that I would like to do. Can I ask everyone to mute their sound? We are expecting a full house today, so if you have any questions, could we ask you to maybe use the chat function or keep them to the end of the seminar where Jacqui will be about and will be able to answer some of them. This is our fourth lunchtime, I suppose, digital lunchtime seminar, and they have been extremely successful. They give you the opportunity to hear from your colleagues on research, findings, and next steps, areas of good practice within organisations, and some people use the lunchtime seminars to raise awareness on specialist areas. If you have work that you think you could share through a lunchtime seminar, please send me an email and we can talk about it. We have permission to record the seminar today, which is great. We will do a little piece of work with it and topping and tailing it over the next few days, and we will make it available on our website, probably towards the end of the week or next week. But when it is available, I will share the link with you. So our lunchtime seminars support your CPD. So please remember, use today's learning for your PRTL or to claim your PIP credits. I also want to take the opportunity, and I'm sure some of you have been to our previous lunchtime seminar, so you'll have heard this wee bit. We have our learning zone. If you're not familiar with the learning zone, please take some time to have a look at it. The resources support you in your work, your development, helps your skills and your knowledge. You can access it very easily on your phone, your laptop, or your computer. There's no password and access is free. We do have a full list of resources, and I will share them when I'm sharing the information from today's seminar with you later in the week. If anyone attended last month's lunchtime seminar, which was the community development, social work community development seminar, we do have those resources. They're now available on our learning zone. So please take some time and have a look at it. Following today, we will ask you, as opposed to a little bit of feedback, and we do this for everything we do. So we will send you an evaluation. Please take a few minutes and give us some feedback. So my name is Alison Shaw and I work in the workforce development team, and I suppose I lead on the lunchtime seminars. And it's lovely to have so many of you join us today. And we thank you for your support. As I said, the seminars are a great opportunity for you to learn in these challenging times. It's also lovely to have Jacqui Montgomery Devlin with us today, and thank you, Jacqui, for taking the time to join us. Jacqui has been involved with CSE throughout her career, Working as a probation officer in England, she specialised in therapeutic interventions with adult male sex offenders. Jacqui worked in Bernardo's NI for 20 years, developing the work and the resources around sexual exploitation of children and young people. She established a service to tackle this. She lobbied on the issue for many years and has delivered training and presentations on the issue to over 4,000 professionals, politicians and the public. And now it's our turn. In 2019, Jacqui joined the Presbyterian Church in Ireland as head of the safeguarding. Tackling CSE remains Jacqui's passion. So I'm not going to say any more. I am going to stop sharing my presentation and my slides, and I am going to let Jacqui share her slides with us and sit back and we'll listen to Jacqui for the next hour and a half. Well, just under an hour and a half. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Alison. Can everybody hear me okay?
Well, I can.
So, you can, okay.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's great. Lovely to be here to do this. And I'm trying not to look at the number of participants that are there. It's a bit scary, but anyway. Yes, Alison's introduced me. I'm Jacqui Montgomery Devlin, and some of you may know me, some of you may not. I have a lot to get through in this time, and because this is, I suppose it's the first time I've really shared the research properly. So really excited about that. But there's a lot to get through, and I may skip bits, so I will let you know when I'm doing that. The research itself, the link to it will be available to you. As Alison said, there's not really any time for questions, but I am more than happy. People send in their questions through to Alison or through to the chat. I will email people back, and I promise to do that with answers, whatever, afterwards. So just before I start, I want to say what I always say, and those of you who know me know I always say this when I'm starting any presentation about safeguarding, in particular CSE. There will be things I will say or may say that you may find upsetting or bring up issues for you, either professionally or personally. So I just say, just in that case, if it does, just look after yourselves and do what you need to do. I will be sharing a lot of quotes, particularly from young people, also professionals. In that, there may be one or two offensive words, not from professionals, I don't think, but from young males. So just wanted to warn you about that. I won't apologise for it because it's their words and their experiences. Okay, so a wee bit of background to the research. As Alison said there, I started work with Bernardo's in 1998, working around the issue of sexual harmful behaviour, children, young people. And then I was asked to develop the work around CSE. I should have said at the start, child sexual exploitation I will refer to as CSE, and child sexual abuse I will refer to as CSA. It'll save me seconds, I know. So from, when I was developing that work, I developed the service. Some of you may remember way back, it was initially called Beyond the Shadows, and then we changed its name to Safe Choices. And I know it's being led at the minute by Claire Lennon, very ably, and it's changed its name again. But so some of you may be familiar with that. I have trained lots and lots of professionals over the years on the issue, and I really, one of my hobby horses has always been the necessity for that multi-agency and interdisciplinary training on this issue. So that's my plug for that. Despite our service up and running, there was still a bit of things unknown, or maybe even to the extent of a bit of denial about CSE happening in Northern Ireland. People tend to think, yes, the places in England, Rotherham, Derby, Oxford, etc., it's happening there, but what, really, Northern Ireland? So I got some funding and we brought in Dr. Helen Beckett into our service for 2 years, and she did the research. Again, even some of you may have participated in that. And that's called, that was Not a World Away, and that was 2011 that was published. So through all of those links, I had links with the University of Bedfordshire, because they have an international centre on sexual exploitation, children, sexual violence and trafficking. So through my links with them, I was kindly offered from Professor Jenny Pierce a bursary to do this research. So of course I jumped at it, even though I knew I was going to have to do it while I was still working full time. So the next step then was to choose a subject to study, and it was just as a result of working in the field of CSE for those kind of 2 decades almost, where I was witnessing young males rarely being recognised as victims of abuse and responded to really with more immediacy as perpetrators of abuse and other crimes. So my aspiration was to achieve a greater understanding as to the reasons for that, and looking at barriers to them disclosing their abuse, but also what was stopping professionals from identifying it in young males as much as females. So in doing that, you know, it wasn't my intention at all to disregard or diminish the impact of CSE on young females. I knew that all too well working in the service. But it became clear during my study actually that whilst several barriers to disclosure and identification may be considered unique to young males, many others pose exactly the same difficulties for young females. So, of course, the literature over the years based on CSE increased, but there was still some criticism that discourse about CSE remained female-centric. So again, that kind of pushed me towards my chosen subject of boys and young men in CSE. And it was also questioned, you know, as to why certain groups of children and young people remain underrepresented in those who were being identified as at risk of CSE. And some of those groups were young males, minority ethnic young people, disabled young people, LGBT young people, and young people in offending. And I'd ask you to keep that in mind when we're going through the findings, because you know, that proved to be the case in terms of the research I did. And I would argue then, if we have a young male and he has one of those other characteristics as well, you know, he's offending, he's LGBT, disabled, whatever, then that really increases the risk of him not being recognised as a victim. So you probably guessed by now from what I've been saying that the research aims were to identify the barriers that young men were finding to disclosure, identify the impediments to identification of CSE in young males by professionals, and consider any relationship between those two. So those were the 3 main aims of the research. Of course, like any piece of research, I'm going to go through fairly quickly the literature review, because I think that sets the whole thing in context. Literature review, telling you about the theoretical framework I used briefly, and the methodology. So in terms of the lit review, I suppose what it did for me, it confirmed that there had been a significant shift in the recognition of CSE as a child abuse issue. And as a phenomenon, it had grown as an issue of concern in the social levels and political levels, thankfully. However, what I found was that had been mainly prompted by children's charities, academic, and some of those high case profiles. that you know, I mentioned there, and we're probably aware of from the media. So, and that evidenced failures in the systems that were actually tasked to protect these young people. And undoubtedly, policy, legislative and definitional contexts relating to CSE have also responded positively to the changes and demonstrated, I think, a greater understanding of the issues. And it's given more recognition to young people, or to that victim status of young people. So in all of that, there were a number of challenges. And I think one of the main ones was implicit in the inclusion of males and females within all of that and all of those changes. I think given the complexities entailed with CSE and the specific nuances involved for both male and females, there was the potential for inconsistencies in interpretation of policy, etc., and the application of it in defining the whole issue of CSE. And I think I would go as far as arguing that the existence of the safeguards that were already in place don't necessarily translate into equity of practice or provision of service for males and females. And I will come back to that later in the findings as well. So determining what's distinctive to male victims of CSE that results in recognition of their status was obviously one of my aims. In the literature, it was coming up time and time again about gender constructions, and in particular masculine ideology. It was exposed as a significant influencing factor in the discourse. And those themes permeate throughout all of the findings, I would have to say. So for me, coming to the end of that, it was like the concept of the deserving and the undeserving to some extent, an establishment of our existence of a moral hierarchy, which currently doesn't appear to be advantageous towards male victims of CSE. We're always saying these things in the hope that things have moved on from year to year. So I'm not going to go through that slide at all, just putting it up to show you, and that is actually in, if you can see it, and I'll plug it at the end, it's in the policy briefing, which has just been recently, I've recently produced that. It will tell you more, as will the thesis, in terms of the prevalence of CSE. Suffice to say, there's an absence of a UK prevalence study in terms of male CSE, and that is a problem, unless somebody's done it since I finished the research. Be happy to know about that. But the known rates of male CSE, I would suggest, don't necessarily mean a lower rate of male than female victims. But what it would suggest is there needs to be more of a focus on why our knowledge about it is so limited. And also, generally with CSE, it is because, probably is in terms of what our knowledge, CSE is a more recent issue that we've been talking about than child sexual abuse is. So again, I'm not going to read that out. Those of you who may be familiar with the field of CSE should be familiar with that definition. All I want to say on that is that I had to decide during the research which definition I was going to use, because it was a UK study. And there have been various debates about definition and limitations on all of that. Suffice to say, one of the problems I had is recognising there isn't neither a global nor an agreed UK definition of CSE. And that in itself can cause problems, particularly on a UK basis, because that can lead to multiple misinterpretations or interpretations and inconsistencies in defining the issue. So moving on to the legal and policy context, again, that you can read about that either in the thesis or in the policy briefing. But there was the introduction of the, that was way back in 2003, the Sexual Offences Act is the primary piece of legislation, England and Wales, but also we have the equivalent legislation in Northern Ireland and Scotland. And that represented a major overhaul of the legislation in relation to sexual offences generally. And within it, thankfully, it did define a child as someone under the age of 18, even though the age of consent to sexual activity is 16. So I'm just going to, that's all I'm going to say on that as well, apart from the fact that, again, potential difficulties remain in terms of responding where there are on a UK-wide level differentiations in policy and legislation. So theoretical framework, I have to say, theory, you either love it or you hate it. And I came to this bit with trepidation, I think, in my research, but by the end of it, I loved it because I was able to find a theoretical framework that really fitted with my research and something I could understand. So just go through that. My reason for choosing the framework I did was because the literature that I'd read for the research highlighted a reoccurrence of particular themes that appeared relevant to my study, including things like masculinity, homosexuality, homophobia, and criminality. And it was evident that such phenomena were not solely a manifestation of the individual male victim, operating in a vacuum, but instead contextual to other factors such as their peer groups, their economic support that they had available, and the prevalence and impact of things like criminality. So what is really important here, and again, I can think back to my practice in the service and the lobbying I did and talking about the significance of contextualizing CSE when responding to it. It's not just about the individual child or young person, it's wider than that. So yes, I chose ecological systems theory because for me that demonstrated what it says there, what the barriers to disclosure aren't just about the male, but they are about the male traits, in the individual traits in the young male, but also about the relationships around them and other factors as well. And likewise, in terms of impediments to identification for professionals, it was about what it is in the individual professional, what it is about their interpersonal relationships and other contextual factors there. And realizing that there can be simultaneous causes for non-disclosure and non-identification. All of that, and you can see from that, just demonstrates the complexity of all of this. It really did. So, you know, if we think we can respond to young males or young females simplistically, that's not going to be the case. We need to take all these other factors into consideration. And I think that slide, which is in the policy briefing, really does demonstrate that complexity involved. But for me, the overarching benefit of using that theory is it does move away from that traditional approach of pathologizing the young person, in this case, the young male, rendering him, as always has, but what often has been, rendering him responsible for navigating the social and structural systems that act as a barrier to his disclosure. So in terms of practice, and if you're in practice, the application of this calls for greater social responsibility, I feel, to create safer places and more effective systems for the young male to disclose what's happening to them. It should also, we're often talking about risk assessments, etc. What this should do is also aid the development of a whole repertoire of assessment instruments and multiple intervention strategies rather than just one. So we'll be coming to the findings soon, but just to mention the research methodology, it was UK-wide. And what I wanted to do was to make sure that I deliver the best outcomes of this study. I wanted to make sure that it was critical to have research that explored the number of perspectives. I didn't want to just talk to young people or just talk to professionals. I wanted to do all of that to achieve a valuable range of data. And I do feel that that was achieved. The necessity of hearing directly from professionals working with in the field of CSE and related fields, to hear from young people who had experienced CSE or had knowledge of it in their past or present social circles. And you will see when I come to give some quotes from young males, some of them, I think the eldest was 30, you will see that in the age probably. But that was them talking retrospectively about their experiences when they were much younger. I also felt it was necessary to look at what the public thought. So the Young Life and Times survey provided that platform to look at that. So it was a mixed methods approach of qualitative and quantitative data. 91 professionals across the UK returned their surveys on it. I did 30 one-to-one professional interviews, 10 interviews with young males one-to-one, and say the Young Life and Times survey, I had a response rate of 1,158. And I'm told, not being a hardened researcher, I'm told that those response rates are pretty good. So I was glad about that. Okay, just moving on. That will give you an idea. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. In terms of professional interviews by nation, 18 Northern Ireland, 9 in England, Scotland, 2, 1 in Wales. And maybe goes without saying, the higher number in Northern Ireland, probably something to do with the number of contacts I already had established here. I did, obviously, with all of this, want to get higher numbers in each of the nations, and it would have been ideal to have it equal across, but that wasn't the case. And in terms of interviewees, professional interviewees by sector, that will give you an idea of where they were from their sector. Again, I think a fairly good wide range there. Okay. I'm sure you're all sitting there and you're all thinking, I have lots of questions about all of that, but I'll say I can answer them all after today. So, research findings, and I had a decision to make here for this presentation. If I was to give you details, the quantitative details as well as the qualitative, we would have been here till this time tomorrow probably. So I decided probably what's more important. You can go and you can look at the research, etc., and get the quantitative data. But I thought what I want to do, perhaps selfishly, was to give you more of the qualitative and the issues that were coming up. So you will see that from the rest of the presentation. So, first of all, I'll say, and again, keep this in mind, and previous to what I said, it ties in with that. Professionals were asked which top 3 groups of young males did they think were least likely, to disclose. And that was what they said: involved in criminality, those with a learning disability, and those from BME communities. Okay. So, and again, just going to fly through this, but came from the professional survey, the top 3 reasons they believe most likely to inhibit disclosure was I should have been able to protect myself because I'm male. fear of being labelled gay if the abuser is male and the victim is heterosexual. And people don't believe this happens to males. Now, what I will say later on is there was some dissonance and some commonality between what young people were saying in the Young Life and Times survey compared to what professionals were saying. But again, I'm not going to cover all of that today. And in terms of inhibitors to identification, what professionals were saying were the top 3 most likely reasons to inhibit identification: a lack of knowledge that professionals had about the exploitation of males. Criminal behaviour can mask the victimhood, so they can't see maybe beyond what is happening criminally. And thinking males are the perpetrators rather than the victims. So evidence of this coming out in the rest of what I'm going to give you in the qualitative stuff. So again, I already mentioned this from the literature review, recurring theme about stereotypical assumptions regarding masculinity being a barrier to both disclosure and identification. So the first one being the view that a young male isn't the victim, can't be a victim, that being the view of others and of the young male themselves. So almost 3/4, I'll throw in the odd bit of quantitative data, almost 3/4 of professional survey respondents thought a barrier to disclosure of young males would be the belief that that CSE doesn't happen to males. Interestingly, the Young Life and Times results somewhat challenge that view, that assumption that fear of not being believed may be more of a barrier to disclosure for young males and females. They didn't necessarily think that was the case. A minority of professionals appeared less assured of the equity in terms of identification and response to young males and females. And your first quote I have here, oh, is it coming up? Yes. So where there has been a disclosure, this professional said, I think legislation is probably used in the same way, but I think where there's only suspicion, I'm not quite sure people would automatically do that with boys, because there seems to be an attitude that unless CSE is disclosed, there is still a tendency to think that boys are just being boys. They're being naughty boys. And I could probably hear other people, if you weren't muted, screaming at the other side of the screen saying, but we do that now, we do that now. And I totally appreciate that. This is what professionals were saying at that stage, and just really what their experiences were. And this isn't necessarily across the board. And the next quote on that, just to demonstrate that, professional said, I know there have been some areas where they've had large rings of boys being exploited. And I've said, well, we've never had any of those referrals. And they look at me blankly and say, no, we wouldn't refer the boys. So I'm not quite sure who they refer the boys to, if anybody. So the physiological reaction of the male was another kind of determinant. People thought in terms of that lack of disclosure. They questioned how this might result in the young male or others questioning the young male's victimhood, irrespective of the gender of the perpetrator or his own sexuality. So this quote said, I've worked with men who have been raped, and it did go to court, but because it came out that they had got an erection, the defense just slaughtered them, saying, you must have enjoyed it because you got an erection. So physiologically, and that's one of the clear differences between males and females, I think, as well, obviously. So turning to the male as being seen as the perpetrator as opposed to the victim, the literature review again highlighted that assumption that often makes a causal link between a male survivor of CSA becoming, or CSE becoming a perpetrator of it. So males are generally seen as the perpetrator of other crime as well, rather than the victims, irrespective of previous abuse. So the main reason young people believe professionals view the sexual exploitation of males less seriously than females was because males are seen as abusers rather than the victims. I'm going to show you a case example of a 15-year-old male which demonstrates the challenge to achieve recognition of a dual status of both victim and perpetrator. So this professional had explained how this young, he has spoken about being befriended, this young male being befriended by a number of adult males who were known to him, knew to be of concern, sorry. But when he wanted to raise the vulnerabilities for this lad, when we wanted to, and he's 15, but he's 6 foot and he's quite heavily built. He's got a learning difficulty, but no one wanted to see him as being vulnerable or being exploited. And we were seeing him, and they were seeing him only as a perpetrator. There are those definite risks, as he was posing a risk, but equally, this is a boy we now know was being picked up of evenings by adults of concern, taken from one area to another, and not being returned home until 3 or 4 in the morning, with nobody reporting him not being home. It took quite a while for advocacy from the service to get people to accept that this was a lad who was vulnerable as well as posing a risk. So they urged the urgency to actually look at that dual status. And another case example illustrated how even in the absence of perceived harmful behaviour, there can be a presumption of guilt that still exists. This professional said, we've had some contact with the Roma community. And there's an example of a 12-year-old lad where he and a young girl were both being sexually exploited by adults, but the language used about him was that he was a perpetrator. The girl involved, who was being exploited by the adults, was marginally older, and she was seen as a victim, but both had been exploited. He was seen as facilitating it, as sexually harmful, rather than being seen as vulnerable to sexual exploitation too. Okay. So moving on to the male, the kind of stereotypical assumption of the male as protector of himself, and the whole issue of that self-preservation. That featured as a common theme again throughout amongst both professionals and young males being interviewed. This professional said a young lad, maybe 15 or 16, goes missing, maybe 3 or 4 times in a month. They, the professionals, think nothing of it because he's a bloke and he can look after himself. But a girl does it, she goes missing for 1 or 2 days, and it's all over Facebook. It's all over the name of the country, online, it's out there. So that differentiation response to them, both the males and the females. And one interviewee suggested these inherent preconceptions regarding a young male's ability to protect himself can influence professional assessment of risk to young males, thus affording them less protection. So they said, whilst we all try to be impartial and non-judgmental, I think we are naive to think it doesn't influence us on some level. And related to that whole concept of the male as self-protector, an additional feature of the male as protector is that of self-preservation. So although it wasn't posed as a question to any of the participants, so the term survival sex was one that descriptor as a route into CSE for males, where there was the need to survive. And that superseded their decision, the young male's decision to disclose his experience. Pete's experience was a case in point. And it's funny, when I was reading over these quotes, I can still hear these young males saying these things. I can hear it in my own head still. So again, it's lovely to be able to share it with you. So Pete said, obviously I didn't want to do it. I did it because it was a way of surviving. I needed money. I was homeless. This other bloke always put it that they were helping me out because I was homeless, and he was finding people for me. It's just something you get into, and it's a way of surviving. And sometimes you've just got no choice but to do the dirty things just to get on in life. Likewise, a professional interviewee also provided a case example of something similar. Like Pete, it became the normality for this young man. They said, I worked with a young male who spends a lot of time sleeping rough. And when it gets really cold and he just can't face another night out, or he can't break into a car for that night or for somewhere to sleep, he actually said to me, you know, well, I just can't bear being cold again. I go and stay at this flat, and I know I'll just have to take it up the bum. That's just what I've got to do sometimes. So that this previously kind of acquired dependence on one particular perpetrator for survival created certainly a complexity of feelings for Pete that he talked to me about, including a sense of guilt and loyalty to his main perpetrator. And he said, then I felt a bit guilty as well, that he, the perpetrator, was being charged because he was helping me. When he went to prison, I felt ever so guilty because he was old and I didn't want him to go to prison. I did feel really bad. So here we've got somebody who's been a victim of CSE and all those complex feelings going on as a result. It speaks for itself, really. I don't need to go on about that. So consideration should also be given to how young males' apparent accommodation of the exploitation may lend itself, how that might lend itself to the inactions of professionals. We really need to think about that in terms of identifying him as a victim. And I remember we used to talk about this in terms of about young people generally in CSE being seen as the willing victim, the willing participant in things, and how we might do that, and exemplifying that whole concept of condone consent. You know, they're seen as coping, they're seen as acting as a willing participant. So what do we do as professionals about it? Do we do anything? So moving on to the young male then as protector of others, and with that, what comes? Shame, self-blame, and helplessness. And you've heard a bit of that, I suppose, in Pete's quotes in terms of the shame and the self-blame. Qualitative data from the professionals, young males, revealed the perception of the young male's need to protect others as well as himself. And I have to say, I was almost quite, I mean, not easily shocked, but I was shocked to the length some young people would have gone to protect others and what they were talking about, and the potential impact of that on their own disclosure. Although the following examples might not be peculiar to young males, and I'll say that again, they do demonstrate the responsibility young males experience in attempting to protect others. This example, this was a young boy who was sexually exploited from the age of 12, yet adamant that he could not risk hurting his mother by disclosing. He said, the professional said, he was very, very concerned about his mum. My mum lives in there, and if my mum knew, it would devastate her, and all the neighbours would be looking at her. And likewise, this young male, The professional said one of the other barriers is that sort of manipulation that goes on. If you tell anyone about this, I'm going to kill you. Your family is going to get it also. So young men think, I can't say this. I'm okay. I can do this. I'll just be abused as long as my mother, as long as my father, as long as my granny, as long as my brothers and my sisters are perfectly fine. I can shield them from this. And maybe it's back to that masculinity issue. I can protect my family by just getting on with it. So the potential consequences of young males perceived failure to live up to the expectations of protector, of self and others, and that the feelings of shame, self-blame and helplessness are with that. I'm just going to show you a couple of quotes on this because I think that they do say a lot and quite powerful. One professional talked about, I think some of our young men are so ashamed that they're actually dangerous. Their antenna for disrespect is so sensitive because of what their trauma has been, that they're inclined towards more extreme violence in terms of abuse of themselves and others, in terms of substance misuse, alcohol involvement in fights and aggression. I think potentially some of the young people we would experience as the young people we would experience as most dangerous are most shame-filled and shame-fueled. And I think for young men, sometimes we forget the extent of that. I'm going to move on from, as Alison said, you can access this. This is recorded anyway, but I'm just going to move on to the threat of masculinity. That whole concept, I think, underpins much of the discourse in relation to sexual exploitation and abuse of young males. One good example from a professional said, one of their biggest fears is their loss of masculinity. I'm a man. These communities are built on strength and power and the size of your muscles. And to say those things out loud is to take away from all of that. Never mind if a report is written about it, or the police get involved, or these things start to get unpicked. And that loss of masculinity is terrifying. Terrifying to the point where I do believe young men would take their own lives before they would actually disclose that. And do we think then, stop and think about why if a young male tries to disclose something and then retracts, we really think about what that's about and how we can better deal with that. So many of the barriers can be impacted by, as well as impact, the ability of young males to communicate about their experiences. So for that reason, I think it's also critical to understand, as well as dispel any myths there are around young males' communication strategies. And that was one of the areas I looked at as well. I think probably this quote kind of is a warning to us all. Let's not make assumptions about gender, because it's a bit of a stereotype that boys don't like to talk the way that girls do. Lots of boys don't, but lots of boys do as well. So it's really pertinent to consider how we can actually facilitate that better. And it actually ended up as one of the recommendations in my research as well. In terms, while we're talking about communication strategies, obviously let's think about how that fits with professionals and applying that to issues in terms of professionals identifying this issue in young males. I think, again, the quotes from young males say so much more than I can about this. And this is a quote from Greg and his experience in terms of how he was communicated with. He said, the police were horrible to me. The education and welfare officers, they were horrible to me. My social worker didn't understand me. No one. I just wanted not to be judged. The police would come round to do a debrief every time I went missing. I went missing 47 times, and every time they came to do the debrief, they would normally come at 2 o'clock in the morning when I was sleeping. and wake me up and tell me how much I'd wasted their time. Just a bad kid. And I've got loads of police looking for me while I'm out having fun, they thought. It was just unbelievable, really, the sheer lack of interest the police had in my welfare and well-being. I almost want to say there, and I'm not excusing what Greg says at all, but you know, these young people's experiences are their experiences, and no one can take that away. I've worked with other professionals across the board, the different disciplines, and have been so touched over the years in terms of their humanity and responding in a way to young people who really need to hear those things at those points in time from professionals. So I just wanted to add that in as well, that, you know, professionals are capable of that. I've seen it. Let's just do more of it. So young Greg, he was able to portray actually two similar situations. He experienced positive as well as a negative response. So two different responses when he went to the same agency, which happened to be an A&E unit in hospital. The first response certainly shows a lack of professional curiosity and concern, and the second is inquisitive and considerate. So first time he said, I went to A&E twice with injuries from the perpetrators of the abuse they had caused. The first time I told them I was in a fight, and they just said, you shouldn't be getting into fights. We have lives to save. Everyone just told me how much I was just a useless waste of time, really. But the second time I went to A&E, a triage nurse said, I don't believe you were in a fight. I think there's people that were doing this to you, and I suspect that you're not going to tell me. But if you do, then I'll have to pass it on. And I just said, well, look, you know, because of her warmth and just her display of interest in my life and my welfare, and even though I'd only just met this woman, I told her. I told her everything. I said, yes, I got beaten up by people, and they make me have sex with them. So the difference in response speaks for itself. So other factors were also evident as having a potential to impact professionals' ability to communicate on issues pertaining to CSE of young males. These included things like personal discomfort in talking about sexual issues. And I've had that on training where professionals have said to me individually, maybe at the break, I feel so uncomfortable talking about this and being honest about it. But hopefully seeking how they can deal with that. A lack of knowledge as well about male CSE, and hopefully that is improving now, and the lack of confidence in talking about the issue. So associated with all of this level of awareness and also of young males, I'll just turn to this as to what came out of the research. One professional said, I think there's something more about young men not realizing that what has happened to them is abuse. A huge barrier to young male is being able to label the abuse, and therefore they're unable to disclose it because they don't know that there's anything to disclose. And again, throughout the years, what I have been saying is if we're not talking about this to young people as professionals, they're not going to know what it is, and they're not going to know it's okay to talk about. So Pete, he endorsed the professional's perception about that. He said, because I consented to everything, I didn't think he was doing anything wrong. Do you know what I mean? I wasn't forced into it. He bought me gifts and bought me mobile phones, credit, took me out for nice meals. Professionals' misinterpretation of behaviours in young males as something other than CSE kind of corroborates this finding. And one professional interview admitted his own shortcomings in terms of his knowledge. I hold my hands up. I don't know a lot about it. I don't know the signs. You're going on your gut. And another professional concerned about others' depths of knowledge surrounding the issue. The amount of people who have said to me, oh, I've been on CSE training, so I know all of that. And I will say, yes, I'm sure you have been on CSE training, but did it address boys? Or did it just have a slide at the end that said, and boys too? So there were examples from young male interviewees who believed that the signs of their exploitation should have been obvious to others, but it didn't result in an appropriate response. And some of them, at times, hard-hitting hearing from them and how they had been failed, but learning in it. There has to be learning in it. So Simon, he said, I used to come home with blood in my boxers and all over my clothes when I'd been abused. Nobody would ever reach out to me. And Pete, he described not so much a professional's lack of awareness, but more an example of what we would call condoned consent, that of professional negligence that I'd discussed in the theoretical framework. So Peter said, I had money, nice new clothes, trainers' gifts, obviously stuff that a young lad can't afford. I was in and out all the time, being picked up all the time, like outside where I was living and in people's houses. I think they knew what I was doing. So it was difficult to know, from Connor's account, this next quote, his perceived lack of response from police to intervene in what was happening to him. And a friend of his, he said, we would be getting into cars, the same cars pretty much every night in the same spot in the road. And there's a police station about 10 feet down the road. And the police would drive past and not one of them would say anything. And they'd seen us both getting in and out of cars. We would get in 10 cars a night. Would be out to 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning. Not one police officer ever said anything. So my hypothesis about all of that I've just talked about is that lack of awareness, of knowledge about an issue can potentially result in a lack of confidence as well in speaking or dealing about it. And almost half of professionals in the survey perceived a lack of confidence in talking about the issue to be more likely to impede identification of males than females, something important to hold on to. So one illustrated a lack of confidence in how to approach the subject. They said, you're scared to say, because if you get it wrong and then it's a real battle, and then if you don't say it, you say it to that young man and risk losing that relationship. And I know the same can apply to females as well, but there was another quote, I think I'm not including it here, but where one professional was concerned, if they say something, do they risk the young person going off and taking his life? So they say they don't say anything. Other issues such as fear of re-traumatizing the victim, again, applicable to young females as well, which can result in a lack of confidence and knowledge in how to deal with it, was an issue that was coming up. Greg, again, perceived how others could and should have intervened in his exploitation, others outside maybe the professional field, and he questioned why no one responded to him in this situation. He said, I remember sometimes I was so terrified of these people because I'd been beaten up for something. And he was talking about his perpetrators. I'd be put in a taxi with another man and I would just stay silent the whole way. And the taxi driver, it's things like, who's that older man you're traveling with at 2 o'clock in the morning? You look like you should be in school. Why are you not saying anything? I mean, it's clear from my face that something's wrong, and the taxi driver and the hotel staff, and even the public in the street, in the town centre. When I got punched in the face, no one did anything. But it's not normal for an adult to punch a child in the face. So that lack of any response, and I think what would be very interesting to know, if that was a young female, what the response might be, if would it have been different from all those people, the hotel staff, taxi driver, public. We need to ask ourselves that. So in terms of solutions around awareness and that, professionals were saying needs to be, and young people were saying awareness of the general public needs to be increased, that of professionals and young males. Training for professionals needs to be focused as well on the sexual exploitation of young males, and an increase in challenge to professionals. Professionals were saying that themselves. They need to be challenged with regards to their knowledge and their beliefs and everything else around the sexual exploitation of young males and their attitudes around that. And one of the things in terms of raising the awareness with young males that came out was that what would be an enabler is for young males to hear from survivors of CSE, other young male survivors, so that would really help. So I suppose just wanted to turn to look at in terms of raising awareness as well. It's part of this is looking at the actual availability and appropriateness of the service. Participants were clear in their opinions about that. What would be needed to facilitate both an available and an appropriate service, and both of those are really important to distinguish. So several professionals had suggestions as to what would be an appropriate and effective service. One was about the length of time that be afforded to young males to engage them in the work, and having been there and having certain funding to work with a certain number of young people, and given a certain length of time, and Claire's online, she will know what I mean. Sometimes that's not the best approach to it. This professional, I think, says this well. It's obviously stigma. Boys don't cry. So I think it takes a lot of time for a young man to build up a level of trust, to feel comfortable and be able to actually state what happened to him. For one particular male, it took over 1.5 years working before he would actually state about the 4 years of abuse. I work for a service that is geared up in terms of not being governed by time constraints, to actually be able to build up a good enough relationship to get to that. A lot of times testing the water. It's seeing whether you do the things you say you're going to do, to see if they can trust you to some degree. Building the relationship with the young person before you introduce some of the things you need to do as part of the requirements within your service. Any assessment can wait. So certainly taking that approach to it. And another aspect of concern voiced by professionals was regarding the gender of the worker. And perhaps not surprisingly, there were different views about this. So I've just chosen to put up this one. It's very much about the worker. I don't think they necessarily need a male or female. In some instances, they may do, but equally, there are some who would need a female worker. We need a child-centered approach, and therefore male-female wouldn't necessarily make a difference. All males don't display the same behaviours. Some are quiet, some are boisterous, some are very violent and dangerous. We need a way of find a way of working with that young person. So, and I think the important thing that people were saying is ask the young person what they want in terms of gender of worker. May seem like a luxury, but if it has that impact, it's so necessary. And in terms of accessibility of the service, and I know in Safe Choices we were guilty of this more or less, well, not a 9-to-5 service, but certainly not weekends. And this professional said, I think there's a whole lot of stuff there which a lot of mainstream projects aren't picking up. because a lot of services are working 9 to 5. They're not out there late at night. They're not out at weekends. And this is when you see a lot of these young people, and that's particularly young males, females too, particularly males. What I want to say at this point, when I came across this issue when I was doing the research, and it goes back to a previous research that others had done, and in particular areas in the UK, there were high numbers of young males in services for young males, CSE services, and that's good, and we thought, right, they must have a lot of CSE happening in those particular areas. Yes, but it was also because the services were there to meet their needs, which is, so if we put up, we have the services for these young males, we will undoubtedly get the numbers in. So just wanted to raise that point. Moving on, conscious of time, to the impact of the perpetrator, gender of perpetrator. Looked at both females as perpetrators and males. So in terms of the females, there were the issues, minimization of harm, concept of the female as a nurturer, as a carer, which helped minimize, again, harm caused by them in the eyes of some. And the physical makeup of the male, how that aided that kind of misconception that males can be abused by females. So I suppose, yes, the sexual abuse, any sexual exploitation of any gender by female really does challenge our prevailing sexual script in society, the physiological makeup of the male, positioning him as the perpetrator rather than the victim. He is the initiator usually, he's the controller of sexual contact, and therefore what that does to us when we hear about males being abused by females. One particular professional summed up the potential consequences of failing to recognise this. They said, as a profession, we tend to minimise the impact on our boys, particularly if the abuse is by a female. So we underplay that it may have been abusive. Now, if we don't accept that females can abuse in that way, we're already minimising the impact when they tell us. And Sammy, he said, young male, he said, you also get the cougar, but that's not normal. But it's the lad culture. Well done, gold star, you've earned your stripes. You've been with this older woman. The professionals saying CSE is certainly a joke in their experience. What happens to males by a female. Something to laugh about, for example, the sexy older teacher. So similar things were identified by young males in interview, and some of them anticipated a lack of response, appropriate response. So what do? You don't say anything. So when it comes to females, Greg said, people have a different attitude to, oh, they had emotional problems, or they must have had some kind of mental illness. It's never that the person is bad, just mad, as it were. And Sammy, he said, she's an older woman, but I'm a guy. I should have known. It's that whole thing. The men have control, no matter what age you are as a male, you can control that. You can do it. But it's never true, is it? Less chance of being prosecuted. I think people know that, so they just don't bother. And in terms of that physical makeup of the female versus the male, you've got a good-looking female perpetrator, grooms this boy, and she says, well, if you tell anyone, I'm just going to tell everybody that you forced me. If that was the other way around, you would not really get a 25-year-old male turning around to a 14-year-old girl and saying, I will tell everyone you forced me. There are a number of males who have been forced into things by women who have said, I can't say anything because they're going to tell people that I raped her, and they will believe her, not me. Again, one of the distinct differences of the male as a victim in this case. So turning to perpetration by males, throwing up a lot of issues, threat to or confusion over their sexual identity, certainly being one of them. Other issues about homosexuality and homophobia as well. So one professional is saying, you know, about that confusion for a young gay male. There's a bigger issue for boys and young men who are abused by males, that the victim then questions their sexuality, almost questioning whether they caught gayness or because they have been abused by the same sex, it might give them some sort of interest in same-sex relationships. Lots of issues going on around that. The whole impact of homosexuality as well. In the literature review, there were 3 aspects to homosexuality were cited as possible, as responsible for creating those barriers to disclosure. One was the belief by others that the male victim of a same-sex assault is gay. The victim's struggle in understanding or naming their own sexual identity, and the victim's own homophobia. But I also use those same concepts in trying to understand the impact of male sexual identity upon identification by professionals. 7 of the young males out of the 10 that I'd interviewed for the study identified as homosexual. 7 of them as homosexual. 1 was bisexual and 2 were heterosexual, but all talking about different issues in terms of that this brought up for them. The beliefs, in terms of the impact of homosexuality, the beliefs by others impacting that recognition, including culture. And we can think of our own culture here in Northern Ireland as well. So Simon said some people are embarrassed because they don't want people to think they're gay. I've had that, and it's caused me so many problems you wouldn't believe. Simon identifying as heterosexual. Narratives from professionals and young people illustrated the impact of negative cultural influences as well towards homosexuality as inhibiting disclosures. Examples were given about from geographical areas around the UK, such as the Welsh Valleys and that, and different cultures. And that included Black and ethnic minority travelling groups, etc. And paramilitary affected communities here in Northern Ireland. And this one was described very aptly by Sammy in Northern Ireland. He said, I think it's the culture of that area. We're actually here. You can't do this, you can't do that. Why would you bother going to the police? Especially in these areas, that's all I've ever known. So that was his experience. You don't go to the police, you don't talk about these things. And in terms of Black and ethnic minority communities, and if you recall, that was one of the areas that professionals were saying was least likely to disclose anything around this. Males who are from a South Asian background may be fearful to disclose due to reasons of honour-based violence and forced marriage. And Malcolm, one of the young males I interviewed, he talked about his own experience from Black Caribbean culture. Some people say, oh yes, being gay or bisexual is wrong, and you shouldn't really associate with anyone who's bisexual or gay. And for me, I could understand that, because if I went back to my home country and they knew, well, I wouldn't be able to go over there because they don't handle that stuff. And at the age of 14, knowing that he couldn't go back to his own home country. Likewise, Males from cultures, talking about the travelling community now here, males from cultures where it wouldn't be acceptable to disclose abuse or sexuality in the traveller communities. It's a big no-no. And I've worked with young men who have been sexually exploited, who are from the travelling community, and especially where there are particular notions of masculinity. You're brought up to box, and that's not your thing, and that terrifies you. Discrimination of homosexuals within religious settings was another cultural aspect, and Sammy gave a good example of that. But I'll move on in terms of misinterpretation. That aspect of misinterpreting somebody's sexual identity, talking about professionals, came up time and time again as an issue. Misinterpretation of a young male being gay, which they viewed as detrimental to identification as a victim. Simon was one of those young males, and he believed certainly that misinterpretation of his sexual identity as gay exacerbated the trauma that he had already witnessed. He said, when I was in foster care, social services put me in with a gay foster carer because they thought that was more beneficial to me, but I never identified as homosexual. I think because I was having some kind of friendship with older males and being found in gay areas, it was this thing of exploring my sexuality. So it was cooler that this gay male would be a positive role model, but I've never identified as bisexual or homosexual. And he said, that can't abuse me as well. Reported concern as how some professionals conflated the concepts of homosexuality and CSE, reflecting a belief that only young gay males can be sexually exploited. Police officer saying male CSE is mistakenly dealt with as sexual exploration. And how many times have we heard that over the years? We have had people say in the past that they're not going to refer them into our project because they're not gay. They're not gay, so they can't be involved in CSE. And another aspect, referring to young males' reticence in actually naming his own sexual identity and struggling to kind of understand that. And these examples where young males identified as gay, but they weren't ready to come out as gay, and sexual exploitation forced that on them. It's not just that you're saying that I've been with this older man and he's done this and this and this, but it's a man. So you get these two things going on. So not only maybe, you know, they take the blame, but oh, you're gay now as well. You've got that double one. And then you've got that to deal with, that in school as well. So it's not just the fact that you've been sexually exploited, but they're saying you're gay now as well. And Darren articulated that really well, that kind of complexity around male on male sexual exploitation. Said ever since they found out about that, it's not my confidence. And it literally made me feel wrong because I'm gay. Why am I doing this? Because it's wrong. It's because I'm gay. It took a good 4 years for that to sink in. And it wasn't because I'm gay. So real struggles with that. And as well then with professionals and their struggles to navigate around all of that, not just the young males' idea of sexuality and sexual identity, but how they're responding to it as well. I'm going to move to homophobia that was identified. Society is either not aware or fearful of tackling the subject, of being labelled homophobic. And there's a concern that an investigation may be seen as anti-homosexual. And again, living in that culture. So fears regarding homophobia and actual bias against homosexuality viewed by professionals as relevant influencing factors, both in non-disclosure and non-identification. Okay, you all doing all right? Still there with me? Going to move on to the last two issues are to do with youth offending. And again, back to what I said at the start about the identified groups by professional, the least likely to disclose, but also the issues that were raised in the literature review around this. I'm going to skip over some of this because I want to look at this, and then the other aspect of this is around paramilitaries and young men in CSE, and that's going to be the focus of the next policy briefing that I have developed, and it hopefully will be out fairly soon. So the tendency of professionals to focus on offending behaviour rather than seeing what else is behind it. So a lot of criminality coming up. A police officer was saying, especially with boys and young men, where they maybe have the history of committing offences. I've spoken to colleagues in other professions where there are young males committing offences, and it's not really looked at properly. They mean the CSE isn't, what else is going on? And that sense of being too quick to rush boys into the criminal justice system when they're kicking off, and looking at what we need to be looking at, what else is that about? Services needing to understand, moving on here. Services needing to understand that boys' response to dealing with trauma is often displayed by challenging behaviour. Services need to see beyond the behaviours rather than just focus on what they see there and then. And where there was an acknowledgement of potential CSE, one professional perceived those concerns kind of overshadowing what else was going on. I think this case example demonstrates three points in terms of the, and I know it's long, but I think it really demonstrates 3 points in terms of how we look at young males. And I said before about that dual aspect of criminal or perpetrator versus victim. So this professional said, I worked with a young guy who was groomed when he was younger. Everyone thought this man was grooming him, and he was saying, no, he's a mate. Eventually got a girlfriend who was the same age as him. And he mentioned in passing to the social worker that he and his girlfriend were sending each other naked pictures. There was no violence, no coercion, no pressure. The social worker heard it, freaked out, and told the police. The police came and recorded the crime in his name. The professional that I was talking that gave this example was reflecting on the disparity in response between both the young male and equally the young female. They were both equally involved in that activity, but he was the one who was criminalised. She wasn't. And in future, then he wanted to be, he named his profession, and he had a DBS check, and it showed on his DBS check this criminal offence, and he didn't get the job because of it. And the really sad thing is that him and his girlfriend then split up, and the man that everybody had expected of grooming him then raped him. Because of the police's overzealous response to the images, he didn't want to engage with the police, and he did not want to give a statement. And he said to me, if they hadn't criminalised me for those images, I would probably have spoken to the police. So thinking then of it in terms of offending behaviour as a manifestation of CSE in young males, the majority of professionals in the survey and interviews demonstrated their personal understanding of offending behaviour as a possible manifestation of CSE-related trauma in young males. There may be more acting out of the trauma through involvement in offending and behaviour in the community. And this behaviour may take the form of criminal damage, assaultive behaviour, and possible fire setting, combined with risk-taking behaviours linked to substance misuse. So all of that, everything that they're saying, and the professionals are saying young males are they felt less likely to have any kind of an outlet, so that becoming more ingrained in them until they actually implode in some way. One professional is saying that, I just want to read this, Adam, in terms of the whole aggression and drugs coming up as a particular issue in terms of offending. And Adam said to me, showed me during an interview, I still have anger, but it was a lot worse. A lot has gone on now because I haven't hit the wall recently. And he had shown me his old scars on his hands from hitting the walls at that time because of what had happened to him. Move on here. Yes, in terms of drugs, Simon's saying you go down taking drugs to get rid of everything. Before, I would just shove 12 grams down my nose one night. Drugs are often used as a pain relief, just as a normal person takes paracetamol to try and take away the headache. So lots and lots of examples of drugs and offending behaviour. One of the probably, I think, one of the saddest things I came across during this was examples of professionals talking about some young males would rather be in prison rather than disclose what's happened to them. That constrained choice. And you can read in the thesis, if you're keen enough to do it, one example a professional gave where a young male at a young age would offend, and he might get young offender sentence for a short period. But as he got older, he said he needed to up his game, and he needed to commit more serious offences to actually get into to prison, because that was his time for the only time he actually felt safe and to get away from things. And yeah, but at the same time, knowing he was expressing his belief that if he stayed in the streets and the sexual exploitation, everything else that was going on, that he was going to die. And that kind of backs up that real self-belief about death, well, suicide or whatever, is backed up in much of the other research as well. So moving on, and I'm conscious of time, 28 minutes past, Alison. Can I ask you, do you want me to keep going as fast as I can? I know people will go as if they need to go.
You can continue. You know, if you've still got some more slides, Jacqui, I'm happy.
I do indeed.
Yeah.
I'll skip through these as much as I can. This is, I'm not going to go through all of these, obviously. Paramilitarism in terms of the impact of fear, control and constrained choice, fear of the consequences for themselves and others. Again, that control through drugs, coercion to perpetrate other abuse against others, the gains from for the young person as opposed to disclosure, examples of that. And sadly, from this kind of, within some of these communities, that sense of tolerance to normalization. This is what happens. This is my life. This is what exists in our community. I'll give you an example of that. Actually, if I skip through here. Yeah, if you grow up in the wrong place, I'll just find the quote here myself. If you grow up in the wrong place, if you were born into the wrong house, he saw that he was never going to live anywhere else in his life, that this was for him the rest of his days. He was never going to be employed or have proper education, but this was how he was going to make his money. This was his future. And they were talking about drugs and criminality for paramilitaries. So everything was tied into this, and whatever was going on the side, well, you just had to soak it up. They meant sexual exploitation. You just had to get on with it. That was his life, and just accept it. Young men get very stuck, say, this is my life, this is the way it is, this is the way it was for my brother, my dad, my cousin. So that sense of not being able to escape that. I skipped through all of those slides really in terms of paramilitarism related to CSE and young males, but as I say, the next policy briefing coming out is related to that. So conclusions, briefly, there was commonality and dissonance between the views of young people and what was in the literature around child sexual abuse. I suppose we need to challenge stereotypical assumptions about males and masculinity. I don't think there's anything new about that, but I think there needs to be a reminder because we can slip way back into that so easily again. We need to look at the importance of roles, role of gender and constructs and socialization. And dissonance again between the views of young people and professionals was very apparent in some cases on some issues. And we need to look at the implications for interpretation of all of these things and the application of policies and procedures to them. I have a couple of slides there. You will see that again, but that was just to show some of the top reasons and the dissonance and commonality between what young people and professionals were saying in terms of barriers to disclosure and their impediments to identifying this. So just finishing off, I will be literally a few minutes here, folks, in terms of the recommendations. First of all, these related to policy and practice, to services, training, campaigns, and further research. The first one was, I had 4 recommendations, 1 related to disclosure, 2 to identification by professionals, and 1 relating to both. So the first one, I said earlier, was relating to the communication abilities of both young males and females and enabling them to disclose. All of that points to the importance of not perpetuating the stereotypical assumptions that we all hold and that are out there regarding young males' communication strategies, because that can hinder potential disclosure. Further research, I am saying, is recommended on contextualizing the reasons why both males and females have difficulty in explaining what their experiences have been, to reveal if there's any divergence in that, and to provide a more in-depth examination of the influence of gender socialization on their respective communication strategies. So if there are any researchers out there listening, there you go, it's a subject area for you. The second recommendation is about when the study's findings illustrated the impact of negative cultural influences towards homosexuality and masculine ideology in terms of inhibiting disclosure. Whilst the data suggests how this inhibited disclosure of young males and their experiences, there was little information about the impact of culture upon identification of professionals. So again, I have recommended that further research would be valuable in relation to the impediments to identification in specific cultural environments where disclosure is prohibited for reasons related to culture. And a specific area of recommendation, which I think, and open to that being challenged, has received little attention, is that within paramilitary controlled communities here in Northern Ireland, a culture which very much embodies masculine ideology. Third one, and just one more after this, another issue emanating from the qualitative data from young males and professionals was that relating to the physiological makeup of males and females. So in addition to those gender constructs, the consequent impact of this upon disclosure and identification, and that was viewed as a particular impediment to identification where the victim was a female. So yes, I'm recommending there's certainly a gap in the knowledge around an understanding of the physiological complexities surrounding female on male exploitation as a prerequisite for reducing the level of minimization connected to that. So research then on that as well. And lastly, the contribution from young males, I have to say that this study was fantastic. 10 young males in terms of the interviews, and then that number of number of young people who responded to the Young Life and Times was just amazing. But what it highlighted was that dissonance between the perspectives on barriers to recognition of CSE in males, between what some professionals were saying and what young people were saying. So it points to the critical importance of involving young people in issues pertaining to their lives and experiences. And we know all of that, and we're always saying it. But my fourth recommendation in particular is that both practice and policy development should be informed by the experiences of young people, utilising whatever methods are necessary and appropriate to do that. And just to finish off, my ultimate aim of this thesis was to prevent CSE becoming more embedded in the lives of young males. And it's been through the shortcomings and the recognition of victims to this. I wanted to achieve an understanding of factors inhibiting recognition, and then I suppose have the hope that have a strategy that challenges both those current systems that are there and the prevailing negative attitudes that young people and professionals have raised in the research. And I only feel, and I think this is where my passion is coming out, that if we accomplish that, we may be on the path to ensuring that young males are afforded the protection that they should have from this horrible crime. And I said that's the number one policy and briefing paper that came out. And thanks to the Safeguarding Board for Northern Ireland for facilitating, I wrote this, but they facilitated the design and the printing of it. So I'm grateful for them. You can find it on their website. Policy coming soon, policy briefing number 2, the influences of paramilitary gangs, as I said, and policy briefing number 3 coming out will be the Association of Youth Offending and the recognition of CSE in young males. So I'm nearly 10 minutes beyond my time, so I do apologise for that. Again, anybody who knows me knows I could talk at length, as I have just done. I put my contact details up there, but I say I am more than happy. I'll be delighted to take any questions after this session today, any challenges, anything else you wish to ask or say to me. More than happy to do that. So thank you all for listening, bearing with me. I really do hope you found it useful in any respects. So thank you. Alison, you're muted.
I know. It took me a wee minute to get the cursor over the mute sign. Thank you, Jacqui. We do have people leaving now, and I have to say we're only 10 minutes over. That wasn't bad going. I think it was extremely interesting, and I could have probably listened for a lot longer. And maybe in the future, maybe next year, we'll have you back to do a follow-up. So thank you, everybody, for staying with us. Thank you, Jacqui. Really appreciate you taking the time to come and share that research with us. We have recorded it and we will put it the link out to people. A few people have asked about the PowerPoint itself, Jacqui, so you can let me know if you're okay for us to share that or not.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you very much for everybody staying with us, and we will send you the links. Thank you.